Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wider Angle. Today's guest is Jonathan Freedland. He is the Guardian columnist, presents BBC4's The Long View. In 2014, he was also awarded the Orwell Special Prize for Journalism. He is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, and his latest book, The Escape Artist, The Man Who Broke Out of Auschwitz to Warn the World, is what we will be talking about today. Welcome to Wider Angle, Jonathan.
Good to be with you, Riada.
You start your book by reminiscing about an experience from a movie theater when you were 19 years old, when you saw a renowned documentary, Shoah. One person from that documentary, Rudolf Vrba from that film, stayed with you years after that day. What was it about him that was unforgettable throughout the decades that followed and made you not just return to research his life, but write a whole book about him?
So you're quite right. It was seeing that film that sent me on this journey to the book that now exists, and 35 years apart, these two experiences. It's worth saying something about this film. It's a very extraordinary documentary. It's 9.5 hours long. That already makes it very unusual. They showed it in the London cinema where I was in two parts, 4.5 hours each. So it was a big ask of an audience to sit there watching it. It's unusual as well because it's a documentary with no archive pictures. There's no black and white footage from the camps. It's only witnesses, interviews with witnesses, their testimony as to what they saw. And one of the people in there, it seemed to me, leapt off the screen compared to everyone else. I mean, what it looked like to me was this procession of very old, grey, broken men and women, defeated almost by what they had experienced. That's what it seemed to me as a 19-year-old. I now realize actually they weren't that old, these people. They were probably, close to the age I am now. But to my 19-year-old self, they seemed old. And then one man just explodes off the screen with this huge charisma. I mean, he is tanned where the rest are pale. He has got a full head of lustrous dark hair. He speaks playfully. He has a weird, disconcerting kind of smile on his face a lot of the time. He speaks in English, whereas the others speak in a succession of language, Russian or Polish or German or French or whatever. He's speaking in English. He's in New York City. He's there at one point. The Twin Towers, as were, are behind him. And he's wearing this tan leather coat. I mean, he looks like Al Pacino in Scarface or something. He looks like a 1970s movie star. And Claude Lanzmann, the maker of the film, almost mentions as an aside that this man, Rudolf Vrba, had done something extraordinary, which is that he had escaped from Auschwitz. Now, as it happens, Lanzmann was not that interested in that. He wanted to talk to Vrba because he had an exceptional degree of testimony to convey because he'd been in Auschwitz so long. And so he interviews him to tell him all about the mechanics of Auschwitz. But I'm sitting there in the audience thinking, tell me more about this escape. He's even age 19. I knew enough to know that Jews in Auschwitz basically didn't escape. It almost never happened. And there are, in terms of documented cases where whether a Jewish prisoner is known to have escaped and successfully made their way to freedom, I count 5 total ever. And the first one of those was actually taken out of the camp by an SS man. So in terms of people who engineered their own escape, Vrba and his escape companion, Fred Wetzler, were the very first. So I was immediately intrigued by that. I never forgot that story. That alone was arresting. But the thing that stayed with me, to answer your question, was the motive for Vrba's escape, because the reason he was so driven to try this hugely risky thing was because he wanted to tell the world, as you said, quoting the subtitle of the book, to warn the world. And that's because he wanted to get the truth out from underneath this mountain of lies. I mean, we'll get into this in our conversation, but Auschwitz-Birkenau rested on just a mountain of deceptions and lies. And he was determined to get that out. And therefore, I found, years and years later, in the era of post-truth and fake news, when everyone was talking about truth, 2016 with Trump, with Brexit, in the years that followed, I found myself constantly thinking about Vrba. And then it came to, 2019, 2020 and the pandemic. And again, people were talking about truth and what you could believe. And I thought, this story has been in the back of my mind for a long time. It maybe is time to bring it to the front of my mind and to tell it properly as a book. And the result is the book we're talking about.
Mm. And the pieces come together slowly. I mean, we will learn from the beginning his early childhood, uneasy early childhood that he had with family life in Slovakia in mid-1920s. And then you lead us through all the historic changes that happened in the 30s as well. And what happened after Munich Agreement, annexation and invasion of the Czech lands. And we understand how he ended up in a Novaki detention camp, and after his unsuccessful escape plan to England, and after the Jews in Slovakia, where he was from, were first publicly isolated, and all set of policies that ended up having them to that resettlement, right, as they were tricked. Now, the reason why I want to ask you about his arrival at Novaki is because it seemed to me while I was reading to be an important introduction and point in that process of Walter Rosenberg, as was his real name, right, arriving to that understanding of what those detention camps and concentration camps were about. So can you please describe us those conversations among people who were just getting there, both in Novaki and later in Majdanek, because they were so genuinely believing and thinking that they are getting to a better place, or that the worst has passed, right? What was that dynamic there?
Yes, you're quite right. So yes, as you say, born in Slovakia as Walter Rosenberg, he is a teenager who experiences directly this steady ratcheting up, this escalation of anti-Jewish measures from a government that is not yet occupied by the Nazis. This is worth stressing. It's a Slovak government, Slovak independent fascistic government, allies of Hitler, certainly, but nobody's telling them to do this, what they do. And they pass their own version of Nuremberg laws, more and more restrictions. So it means that Walter can't go to school anymore. Very bright boy, turns up for school in Bratislava, told there's no place for you here anymore because you're a Jew, you can't go to school. And, in the ratcheting up, one day comes this order to all the Jews of his age that you should present yourself at this place at this time with, no more than 25 kilograms of possessions, where you will be taken away. And most people at that point think, okay, so we've had all this horrible persecution where we've not been allowed to own a business or property or to travel or to, gather with other people in public or go to school. So now, okay, this surely is going to be a resolution of all this. They're going to send us somewhere where we're allowed to live. And as they're almost relieved by that. And he has this defiant, prickly nature, even at age 17, which is when this order comes, which makes him say, well, of course, I'm not going to get on a train and be deported. This is where I live. I'm a Slovak citizen. My mother tongue is Slovak. No, I'm not going to do it. And he begins this series of escapes. I mean, the reason I call the book The Escape Artist is he doesn't just escape once. He is a serial escapologist throughout his life, both before Auschwitz and incredibly after Auschwitz too. So that's what I wanted to bring out. But in Novaki, yes, the conversation among the other Jews who've arrived there, for one thing, they're baffled. They have no idea what's going to happen or when where they're going to be taken away or when. They're waiting for these trains. They're told it's a transit camp. What does that mean? But there isn't this existential fear. Nobody thinks, you know what, this is the beginning of the Holocaust, because no one knows about the Holocaust yet, because nothing like it has ever happened in human history before. And this is crucial it's a crucial part of the way I try to tell the story, which is that, there's no hindsight in this story. He doesn't yet know what all the meaning of these places is. And so there is a measure of relief. There's a measure of compliance where people think we should, now that we're here, let's just settle. There are families who are allowed to live with their kids, and they think, okay, we're in a tiny, tiny hutch. It's not even a room, but we'll make it work. And he is different from the others in that he, from the beginning, the moment he sets foot there, is trying to think, how do we escape? But I think that contrast between how he reacts and how the other people around him react is valuable. It's worth knowing, because I think the majority were like the people around him. They did not know what was going to happen, and they always, in a way, assume the best. It's a kind of human coping strategy. And he witnesses that and describes it.
And he was there only for 12 days, actually, in Majdanek before he was transported to Auschwitz in June 1942. Didn't he also at the time still think that he got a better deal and a step up of a sort when he was
That's right.
when he went there? And it was there slowly, I mean, well, soon enough, actually, that he understood that, as you write, death was all around. And 4 out of 5 Jewish arrivals there, as you remind us, were selected for immediate death. So
at least, yeah.
What routines, how did he decide to start memorizing all these things, all these routines in Auschwitz when he was 17, like you say?
So yeah, absolutely. So he's fleetingly in Novakia, where we talked about. He then goes to Majdanek, which would become notorious as another death camp. He's there only 12 days. They look for volunteers for a better job, to become volunteer farm workers, still obsessed with escape. He thinks, well, that will be good because then I'll be out in the open. So he volunteers, having no idea that the destination is Auschwitz. And when he sees the name Auschwitz, he doesn't get struck with terror because he's not like us. He's never heard of Auschwitz. Nobody has. So he looks at these buildings that are built of brick, the paths are paved, and he thinks, well, this is better than Majdanek was, which was just sort of boggy and temporary, flimsy wooden structures where people would really freeze. He at night, he thinks, okay, this is all right. There's order here. These SS in charge of wearing their crisp uniforms. Okay, I can make something of this place. And it does dawn on him very slowly. I mean, he's first of all in this place, Canada, where all the possessions, or it's a nickname that the prisoners give because they imagine the real Canada is a place paved with gold, and they're in this place where the Jewish arrivals in the camp have been dispossessed of everything they've brought. And so there are piles of clothes and pots and pans. And it's only slowly that he begins to realize there's more stuff here than there are people. I mean, I'm looking at, for example, children's clothes, and yet I don't see any children. And the penny drops with him. He realizes he's in a place the like of which has never existed before, a killing center. And he's then, because he works as all people who were not gassed immediately, they are slaves. They work as slave workers at different places in the camp. And he moves from Canada, the warehouses where all the stuff is taken, eventually to the Alte Judenramp, the old Jew ramp, the railway platform where each train arrives. The Alte Judenramp is the name the SS gave it. And he sees trainloads after trainloads of Jews arriving. And the one thing he realizes they all have in common is they have no idea what is about to happen to them, that they are clueless as to the meaning of Auschwitz, as to the purpose of Auschwitz. The word doesn't mean anything to them. The place doesn't mean anything to them. And as these people, dazzled, bewildered, dazed and bewildered, as they come off the trains, he sees that they too are relieved to be there because they have no idea. And the realization comes to him with tremendous insight. A teenager, still 17, 18 years old at this point, he realizes that the one element that the Nazi killing machine relies on more than any other is deception. That it's the fact that they deceive their victims that enables the Nazis to proceed in an orderly fashion with this mass slaughter. They need the Jews who they are processing to be calm, to be orderly. And that means they must be deceived. And so they are lied to, and I detail it in the book, lied to at every stage of the journey, elaborate, complex lies, fake messages from people who've already been there saying it's all fine. They're told that famously that they're going just to have a shower. They're asked what their professions are, because after the shower, they'll be able to work in their professions in this new community that is being built there. They have no idea. And so to your question, what Walter realizes is that if this machine is to be broken, the key cog in the machine you have to break is deception. And that means the Jews of Europe who are currently ignorant as to their fate have to have their ignorance broken. The veil of ignorance must be torn. And that will require, he realizes, someone not only to escape, but to escape armed with facts. And he knows, he's very self-aware. He realizes that as a teenage boy, people won't believe him. unless he has got absolute nailed down facts. And so he sets about, and it's an extraordinary feat of memory, memorizing every transport that comes in, every train load, by the point of origin, the estimated number of cattle cars, the number of people per cattle car. And the Nazis obviously had this very complex system of numbering. They would number those people who they took off a transport and worked as prisoners. That number would be the number tattooed on their arms. That number corresponded. It was different for each transport. And so Walter, in this extraordinary feat of memory, tallied up the numbers with the transport, with the point of origin, with the date. And so he could say, that on the 15th of May, 1943, a transport came from Grodno containing X number. And he could do that for sometimes 5 transports a day, every day, for the nearly 2 years he was there. I did toy with calling this book The Memory Man, because as well as being the escape artist, he was the memory man. He had an extraordinary, almost freakish memory.
One thing that came to my mind while reading your book and now listening to you again, when we speak about deceptions and many descriptions that personally, probably because of my background that I shared before recording as a Bosniak, were difficult to read, was how they tricked them until the very end, until the very moment, until these people were led to the gas chambers. Not just those facts that you shared about lying about the life that would be there, so take your books, take all your possessions, etc., was the hypocrisy and the evil of the SS, the Nazi soldiers inviting them, oh, don't worry about it. Honestly, the images that those lines brought back to my mind was a recording of Ratko Mladic, Bosnian Serb war criminal, and there's a famous video of him literally giving out chocolate and candy to Bosniak kids on July 12th, 1995, right when the military operation was about to start, similarly claiming things to the Bosniak population in the Srebrenica enclave. Don't be afraid. Nobody will do anything to you, as he promises. And that video was broadcast to the world. And then, a couple of, lines later, you describe what you just elaborated here, that all of that had a clear purpose. The deception had a clear purpose. And just reading about that, I just have to share, because it's the deception part and just why the Nazis hid it, and all the things that you so vividly describe, again, brought echoes of the detention and concentration camps from Bosnia in terms of Kozarac, Omarska, and Ternopolje, not at all disclaiming the singularity of the events, but the fact that they were hiding it as well. And these concentration camps were discovered by foreign journalists, but even when the world learned about it, the atrocities went on. And so I want to ask you about it. I'm sorry, I don't want to.
Not at all. No, I'm so glad you shared this with me, and you did mention it before we recorded, and I said to you then that there are echoes here. As you say, the Holocaust is a singular event, but there are echoes, and it's important for me and for others to hear the Bosniak experience as you've recounted it. The echo I had in mind when I said this to you, the point about deception that you've mentioned with Ratko Mladic is very powerful, and the Nazis were engaged in those, face-to-face deceptions. What you described there about Mladic telling individual actual victims he can see, lying to them. The Nazis did the same. They did lie directly to the face of their victims. And I think a lot of people have known those stories about, for example, the fake shower heads in the gas chamber, so that, or even handing people a towel and a bar of soap before they went in, maintaining to the very last moment the deception. I know that myself, when I first heard those stories years ago, when I was probably a child or a young person, I thought that was just a kind of macabre sense of humor, that it was some kind of sick joke. I now realize it was absolutely operationally central to what they were doing, because if somebody at that last stage had said, my God, they're going to kill us in this is not a shower, it's a gas chamber, there would have been panic and there would have been a stampede, and that chaos would have slowed down. I'm not saying it would have stopped, but it would have slowed down the Nazi killing machine. They needed calm and order. And very memorably, Rudolf Vrba says in one interview that the Nazis, he says it at different points, the Nazis needed the Jews to be, it's much easier, he says, to hunt pigs or sheep. Sorry, it's much easier, he says, to hunt sheep than it is to hunt pigs or deer. That sheep proceed in an orderly column, pigs or deer can run in different directions, and how much easier an abattoir operates than have a shooting party where you have to, with a rifle, pick off one and then another and then another. It takes time. And if the Jews had scattered and escaped and panicked on that railway platform, they would have become deer, whereas the Nazis needed them to be sheep. But the echo I had in mind with your Bosniak experience was this. Walter Rosenberg, as he was convinced that the mere act of revelation, of disclosure, of telling the world what was happening would instantly, as if by a law of physics, stop what was happening. As soon as the world knew what was going on in Auschwitz, of course, the world, the Allies, would stop it. To him, the proof that the world did not know what was going on was the fact that Auschwitz existed. Because clearly no world would allow gas chambers to exist if they knew about it. So therefore, ergo, they cannot know. That faith that reporting or bearing witness would bring a halt to an atrocity, when I was reading about it, immediately brought back a memory of journalistic colleagues of mine in the 1990s who were covering the Bosnian War, the Balkan Wars, who were driven by their conviction that all they had to do was put the revelations of, you mentioned the camps at in Bosnia, those camps, it was a Guardian colleague of mine, Ed Valjami, who was involved in revealing those to the world. He and other journalists, I never covered that war. I was just starting out in my early 20s and was too young to be sent as a reporter there, but colleagues of mine were, and they were all seized by the notion that all we have to do is report it and the world will act. And for many of those journalists, it was a crushing experience. I mean, a sort of a faith-breaking experience in their lives that the world did not act the way they had hoped. Now, eventually, of course, there was action and intervention and so on, the Dayton Peace Accords and so on. But they felt my reporter colleagues and friends were driven by the idea that it would be somehow instant, that the world would be so shocked. And Rosenberg was the same. As a teenager, he had that faith in the human race, that if the human race knew this was happening, obviously they would have to bring it to an end.
And so many other situations that we could talk about, or Syria, even the situation, I mean, it always comes to my mind, the digital technology that we have here, the speed with which we can witness what is happening from Xinjiang to Ukraine. But maybe that's something we can talk about when we get to the conclusion. I want to ask you about, so he became a student of escape, as you mentioned, and in the book, and here you addressed it, and he really planned everything meticulously. He got great tips from Dmitry Volkov, who was a Soviet prisoner of war that he met there. He made a plan, found a companion. Finally, after numerous attempts from 7th April to 10th April, he got out in 1944. He and Fred Wetzler, as you said, they were the first Jewish prisoners who successfully escaped Auschwitz. What happened then, how did the famous Vrba-Wetzler report get made, distributed afterwards, and the fallout of that distribution that kind of is tied to what we were just talking about?
It is, yeah. No, he's driven by that faith that if you reveal it, it will stop. He devises that plan for escape. They do it together, he and Fred Wetzler. I think they do the devising together. There are other prisoners who've also, by their earlier attempts and their failures, Fred and Walter learn from them. He becomes, like, as we said, a student of escape, and gets help from that old Red Army soldier, a Ukrainian, incidentally, from Zaporizhia. And it's great that you haven't revealed exactly how they do the escape, because I really want people to read that. I mean, I would say this because obviously I'm biased, but as a boy, a man of my age, a boy in the 70s and 80s, I read a lot of World War II escape stories, and I'm biased, but I think this is the most thrilling one ever of the whole of the war. It's just so extraordinary. The odds are so against a Jew escaping from Auschwitz. Others did escape, Polish prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war. Almost no other, next to no other Jews had ever done it. Certainly none had ever done it successfully before, and very few afterwards. As I said, a total, I think, of 5. But they do it, and you'll have to read the book to find out how they do it. It's brilliant. It doesn't just require physical resilience; it requires a brilliant brain. There's a fantastic bit of ingenuity. They spot a gap in the Nazi defenses, not a literal gap, not a physical gap, but a weakness, and they exploit it with brilliant insight. But they get out, and then they find themselves, that doesn't mean they're then free, because they're in Nazi occupied Poland. And if to be as Walter, he becomes Rudolf Vrba later, but as Walter would later say, we got out the camp and we were there with no map, no compass, no friends. There was no resistance network to help Jews who got out of Auschwitz. Yes, for the Poles and for the others, but not for the Jews. They are on their own. And so proceeds this period of 11 days in which they are crossing mountains and marshlands and forests and rivers, crawling along the ground, sometimes only able to move at night. It's not safe to move during the day. Not safe because there are Germans around, German Wehrmacht. At one point, they get pursued by Germans who fire at them, on them. There are also, ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche, who have settled in Poland, and there are Polish collaborators on the ground who may betray a Jew at any point. So it's incredibly dangerous, but somehow they do it, and they find their way to their home country of Slovakia, cross the border, and there they make contact with the remaining tiny Jewish community of Slovakia that has managed to cling on despite the deportations that sent Walter and Fred to Auschwitz. And they're in hiding in the basement of a Jewish old people's home in Žilina. They pour out their data. They pour out everything they've memorized. And there are, lawyers and others who working, secretly, clandestinely for the Jewish resistance, really, the Jewish underground, who write down what they hear and transcribe what they hear and type it up and turn it into a 32-page, single-spaced, detailed report, which is really dates, places, numbers. It's written in like a very dry scientific paper, because they were obsessed with the idea that they wanted this to be taken as factual, that this isn't just hysterical, overheated claims. There's no rhetoric in the report. It is a very factual, scientific text. And that report then embarks on a kind of journey of its own. It has to make its own escape out of occupied, or rather fascist-ruled Slovakia, and through occupied Europe. And it has to be passed across borders secretly, hand to hand. It is translated in dark attics in Hungary, or and it's secretly shown to churchmen in basements. It is not published. It is instead samizdat, handmade copies are passed. And I don't think anybody until my book has actually pieced together the journey in one place of the report, which is a remarkable escape story of its own. But somehow it does, hand to hand, cross occupied Europe until it does reach the desks of Winston Churchill in London, Franklin Roosevelt in Washington, and Pope Pius in Rome. They all get to see this report, the testimony of, still age 19, now renamed under false Aryan papers, Rudolf Vrba and his escape partner. And so then the question becomes, what will the world do with it? Walter/Rudy himself believed that, of course, they would immediately act. Instead, the report runs into 3 sets of obstacles, and the third of one is the most interesting. So it runs into practical problems where, in Whitehall, in Washington, in London and Washington, there's this request that has now been attached by Jewish leaders to the report, literally attached with a paperclip, saying, bomb the railway tracks to Auschwitz, because if Auschwitz is a factory of death, then take out the conveyor belt. practical objections are raised to that. You know, the RAF, the Royal Air Force in London, they only bomb during the nighttime, and they say this should be done at the daytime. Send it over to Washington. Days and days and days go by while they're bureaucratically deliberating. So it runs into practical problems. It runs into prejudice. There are officials in London who say, you know, we've done enough for these wailing Jews. We've got to allow for a certain degree of Jewish exaggeration. In Washington, somebody reads the report and says, it's too Semitic an account, you know. So it runs into anti-Jewish prejudice, anti-Semitism. But the main problem, the one problem that in a way Rudy and Fred did not really anticipate, is it runs into the human inability or unwillingness to believe in truly terrible tidings, that human beings, maybe as some kind of coping mechanism, can build up all kinds of walls before believing something terrible. And the most extreme case of this is in Hungary, which Rudy was so desperate for his report to reach Hungary because the Jews of Hungary were the last community not yet touched by the Nazi hand, not yet pulled into the Nazi inferno. There were some 600,000, 700,000, 800,000 Jews in Hungary. He was desperate they get his report. The report did reach the Jewish leadership in Hungary. And for a whole mixture of reasons, different reasons in different cases, but part of the problem it encounters there in the Jewish council, the Jewish leadership in Budapest, is, I can't believe this. How do we know this isn't the feverish imagination of two young men? And the report ends up sitting in a drawer rather than being distributed to the people who most needed to hear it. And there are cases, and I describe them in the book, of even when people were warned directly, when they saw the report themselves with their own eyes and told, you know, in one case, a young man saw it and told his uncle, we are going to be put on trains and sent to our deaths. His uncle doesn't just not believe him, he gets furious with him, red-faced, and starts trying to hit his nephew. How could you say such a thing? People cannot bear to hear it, literally cannot bear it. And so what the painful discovery of the Vrba-Wetzler report, the painful lesson, is that information alone, and the report was full of information, 32 pages worth of information. Information alone is not enough. That people have to not just have the facts, they have to believe them. And that is not the same thing, that people can have all kinds of information but not believe it. And that, of course, will echo with your own history and experience in Bosnia, where the world knew but didn't believe or didn't fully. But even now in something completely different, you think of the climate crisis, the scientists putting all this evidence in front of us. On some level, we're still resistant to truly believing it, to internalizing it and making it deep knowledge. And so, you know, despite all his heroism, Rudy and their heroism, Rudy and Fred ran into that problem of human incredulousness.
Denial was the most natural escape, as you write in the book. I can only imagine how depressing and infuriating and saddening that was for him when he was dealing with all of that. You describe in the book the decades after the war and how, you know, both turbulence in his personal life, to not give out too many spoilers, but you say at one point how Rudy came to realize that denial had not stopped in those decades after war. So it just presented itself differently, you're right. So I'm curious, I mean, can you elaborate on that? Because, and I want to ask you, why do you think that there is a lack of recognition of Rudolf Vrba as you speak? Why do you think? Yes. Why do you think he should be celebrated as well for his role in preventing the deportation of 200,000
Well, let's get on to
Jews?
That. Let's tell that story, because just before people get too sort of down about this story, it does have an incredibly heroic other side to it, which is, yes, the word did not get to all the Jews of Hungary, especially people who lived in the provinces, which was a source of great heartbreak to Rudolf Vrba. 437,000 Jews in the provinces were transported to their deaths in Auschwitz, and that was terrible for him. But on the other hand, through a series of diplomatic moves, which I set out in the book, the report led, and particularly the publication of the report, because it did also reach eventually a journalist in Zurich, a British journalist, who revealed it to the world. And that has a sort of domino effect And the knock-on effect of all those things, I charted in the book, is that eventually the ruler of Hungary calls a halt to the deportation of the Jews. He's been perfectly happy to allow them to be deported until then, but the publication of the report means the secret is known and it's out. He calls a halt to the deportation of Jews, and literally at that moment, there were 200,000 Jews in Budapest who, had it not been for that sequence of events started by the Vrba-Wetzler report, would have been taken to their deaths in Auschwitz. And instead, those 200,000 lived to see another day. Now, several tens of thousands of them would later be killed by the later rulers of Hungary. But it means that a colossal number of Jewish lives, tens of, in close to 200,000, certainly north of 100,000, were saved by Rudolf Vrba and Fred Wetzler and by their report. And that, to me, makes them towering figures of the Shoah period. And it's why I say in the book that I think the story of Rudolf Vrba deserves to rank alongside Anne Frank, Oskar Schindler, Primo Levi as the epic stories that define our understanding of the Holocaust. He belongs in that first rank because of what he did, the heroism of what he did escaping, but also nearly 200,000 lives saved. So that is huge. So then to your question, why is it that he is not more recognized? I think this also says something in some ways timeless, and I hope resonant for your own experience and other experiences, is that I think we have very peculiar demands that we make on people who go through truly horrific experiences. I think we somehow expect them to be almost sort of angelic figures or sort of transcendent figures. That we believe an encounter with a Holocaust survivor, we expect from it as if it should be like an encounter with the Dalai Lama, that we should come out elevated and spiritually cleansed and uplifted. There's a sort of expectation that survivors will say, look, I've glimpsed into the darkest heart of humanity, and I can tell you that ultimately all human beings are good, and we'll leave with a feel-good sentiment. Vrba did not provide that. I mean, I found a document from Vrba writing to a TV producer who wanted to interview him, and he said, I should warn you, I am not your cliched Holocaust survivor. Meaning, I think, I'm not going to tell you a fairy tale in which all the evil belongs with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Germans, and everyone else is noble and good. That was not the story he had to tell, because there was the inaction by London and Washington. There was that failure by the particular man leading the Hungarian Jewish community, failed to pass on his warning. It meant it wasn't an easy story of black and white. And I spoke to people who said, look, we just couldn't invite Rudolf Vrba to speak at our events or panels because he would descend, they said, into accusations and rage. He would start pointing the finger at all those who had failed to pass on his warning. And so the invitations didn't come. People didn't want that kind of survivor. And I think we do that a lot to people who've survived national or individual moments of great trauma. If they don't provide a comforting narrative to us, well, we'd rather not listen. And the angry survivor is not the survivor people particularly like. They'll say they do, but they won't actually give them the podium or platform because it's uncomfortable for everyone, somebody pointing a finger. So I think Rudolf Vrba and Fred Wetzler, for different reasons, they suffered from our own needs to look away and to not hear about terrible things, including terrible things in our own recent history.
And last question. You mentioned the importance of talking about this in the post-truth age. You've addressed different contemporary issues like climate crisis, etc. One thing that I shared with you before the recording of this is that incredible situation of so many of us maybe even thinking that we know what happened, in those years. We learned, then yet so many stories, so many situations, so many people resurface thanks to researchers, writers, journalists, and it's important. Is that another wider angle of this story, maybe?
Yeah, I think it is. I think with these episodes of horror in our history, I think we feel that somehow the further away we are, the clearer it will become or the harder we look, the clearer it becomes. It's not like that.
Mhm.
It's somebody once said to me, it's like a really dark mountain that you're looking at nighttime, which is almost the longer you look at it, the bigger you realize it is. You know, the outcome, the outline of it becomes even bigger. The Holocaust is so, it teaches so many, has so much to teach us that I think almost any individual story that has some connection to it is fascinating. And therefore you realize there is just this deep seam to be mined. There is so much in there that there are millions of stories, because 6 million people were killed. 6 million Jews were killed. There were, of course, you know, all kinds of other groups who were targeted, the Sinti and people who Vrba testified in several trials of Nazis who were accused of and were convicted of killing Sinti, people we might call travelers or gypsies, as the Nazis called them. You know, there are so many stories to tell. It's one of these things where it's a well that, just to change the metaphor, the deeper you sink into it, the deeper you realize it is. And so, and I think the same will be true. More stories will come out about the Bosnian conflict and the Bosnian tragedy as time. I think we've barely scratched the surface of the Bosnian story, actually. I think perhaps similarly with Rwanda. You know, we know so little, partly because when it's immediately happened, there is a desire, not from the victims. I think the victims do want to talk, but there's a victim from the case in the Holocaust case, it was that the rest of the world was not ready to listen. It took a long time for people to actually be ready to hear. And I think we're going through another iteration right now, because most of the survivors are dying out. And therefore, something now felt to me the right time to tell Rudolf Vrba's story. There was something about the passage of a lifetime that made me feel there would be people ready to hear it, because a lot of people were not ready to hear what Vrba said because he was too angry and so on. So I think these huge episodes in human history they sort of defy gravity, in the sense the deeper you go into them, the deeper they become. I don't think you ever touch the bottom.
Jonathan Freedland, thank you so much for joining me at Wider Angle today.
It's been a pleasure, Riada. Thank you very much.
The Escape Artist, The Man Who Broke Out of Auschwitz to Warn the World, is available at all bookstores in UK and US. For all of you, stay tuned for more conversations with people from all over the globe. Thank you.